The Gucci family spent 70 years building a throne of Italian leather, only to pay a hitman 600 million lira to destroy the man sitting on it. On a crisp morning in March 1995, the heir to a billion-dollar fashion dynasty was gunned down in the foyer of his office. This was the Maurizio Gucci murder, a cold-blooded execution that exposed the rot inside the House of Gucci history. He didn't die because of a rival brand or a failed bank loan. He died because of a psychic's advice and a divorce settlement that was deemed too small. But the real reason the Gucci bloodline was purged from its own company wasn't the bullets. It was a secret document signed in a Swiss hospital that turned a family business into a corporate autopsy. Patrizia Reggiani, the woman the world would call the Black Widow of fashion, watched from the shadows as her former husband took his final breath. This Gucci family betrayal was the final act of a fashion empire downfall that had been brewing for decades. This is the dark history of the fall of the House of Gucci. Gucci did not start with a silver spoon. He started with a silver tray. As a teenage porter at the Savoy Hotel in London at the turn of the century, he was a ghost in the hallways of power. He spent his days hauling the heavy trunks of the British aristocracy and the American industrial elite. He watched how men like Winston Churchill and the Vanderbilts carried their status. He realized a fundamental truth of the human ego. Wealth isn't just about what you have. It is about how you carry it. The luggage was the signal. It was the armor of the upper class. In 1921, Gucci returned to Florence with a vision of distilled snobbery. He opened a small shop selling fine leather goods to the local nobility. These were people who owned horses, estates, and centuries of inherited pride. Gucci wasn't just building a brand, he was building a cult of exclusivity. He used the finest Tuscan hides and the most skilled artisans in Italy. But Gucci was a man of contradictions. He was a devout Catholic who worshipped at the altar of profit. He was a father who believed that peace was a sign of weakness. Gucci had 3 sons, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo. He didn't raise them to be partners. He raised them to be gladiators. He intentionally pitted his boys against each other, rewarding the one who showed the most aggression and punishing the one who showed mercy. He believed that competition among brothers kept the business sharp. He thought he was tempering steel. In reality, he was planting the seeds of a civil war that would last 3 generations. He created a corporate culture where betrayal was a survival skill. By the time Gucci passed away in 1953, the brand was a global powerhouse, a symbol of the Italian Renaissance. But the family itself was a collection of loaded guns. Aldo was the visionary who wanted to conquer the world. Rodolfo was the actor, a man of vanity who preferred the spotlight to the workshop. As the patriarch's body went into the ground, the brothers didn't mourn. They began calculating. They inherited a gold mine, but they also inherited their father's greatest flaw, the inability to trust their own blood. The throne was vacant, and the fight for the crown was about to turn the streets of Florence and New York into a boardroom battlefield. They had the money, they had the name, and they had the momentum. But they were about to learn that an empire built on spite is an empire built on sand. Aldo Gucci was the man who transformed a Florentine workshop into a global religion. While his brother Rodolfo stayed in Italy, obsessed with his film career and the aesthetics of the brand, Aldo looked at the map and saw a vacuum. In 1953, just weeks before their father died, Aldo opened the first Gucci boutique in New York. It was a calculated gamble. He knew that the American elite were desperate for European lineage. He gave it to them. He didn't just sell bags. He sold 1,000 years of Italian history in the form of a bamboo handle. By the late 1960s, the double G logo had become the ultimate status symbol. It was the uniform of the jet set. Grace Kelly, Jackie Kennedy, and Elizabeth Taylor were walking advertisements. Aldo was a marketing genius who understood the psychology of the, quote, zero long before his competitors. He realized that if you make something hard to get, people will kill for it. He created a sense of scarcity while simultaneously expanding at a breakneck pace. The company was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and the profit margins were astronomical. A bag that cost $30 to manufacture was retailing for $400. But Aldo's ambition had a dark side. He became the king of licensing. He realized that the Gucci name was more valuable than the Gucci leather. He began selling the rights to put the logo on anything and everything. At one point, there were over 22,000 different Gucci-branded products on the market. You could buy Gucci lighters, Gucci keychains, Gucci pens, and even Gucci toilet paper covers. It was a gold mine that brought in $500 million in annual revenue by the early 1980s. But this was short-term thinking. The brand's prestige began to bleed out. When you can buy a Gucci keychain at a gas station, the magic disappears. The elite began to look elsewhere. Inside the boardroom, the tension reached a boiling point. Aldo's sons were frustrated. They saw their father as a tyrant who refused to share power. One son, Paolo, even tried to start his own Paolo Gucci line, leading to a physical brawl during a board meeting where blood was literally spilled on the mahogany table. The family was drowning in cash, but they were starving for control. They were so busy fighting each other that they didn't see the tax authorities and the investment bankers circling their fortress. Maurizio Gucci was the golden boy, the only son of Rodolfo. While his cousins were fighting over scraps of the licensing empire, Maurizio was being groomed for the throne. He was a man of immense charm and even greater appetites. When Rodolfo died in 1983, Maurizio inherited a 50% stake in the company. Suddenly, the quiet, studious nephew was the most powerful man in the fashion world, and he intended to live like it. Maurizio didn't just want to run Gucci, he wanted to inhabit it. He lived a life of absolute excess that made the original aristocracy look like paupers. He purchased the Creole, a 200-foot wooden schooner that required a crew of 22 just to sail. He spent millions of dollars on its restoration, insisting on rare woods and custom brass fittings. He moved between a multi-story penthouse in New York's Olympic Tower, a sprawling villa in St. Moritz, and a palatial estate in Florence. At his side was Patrizia Reggiani. She was the daughter of a waitress who had married into wealth, and she had a hunger for the high life that bordered on pathological. The press called her the Elizabeth Taylor of luxury. She famously remarked that she would rather cry in a Rolls-Royce than be happy on a bicycle. Together, they were the ultimate power couple of the 1980s. They traveled by private jet, collected rare art, and threw parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maurizio had a grand vision. He wanted to return Gucci to its high fashion roots. He wanted to terminate the 22,000 cheap licenses and make the brand elite again. He hired Don Mello from Bergdorf Goodman to overhaul the image. He was trying to pivot a massive tanker in the middle of a storm. He had the vision of a king, but the bank account of a man living on borrowed time. He was spending money the company didn't have, and his lifestyle was funded by loans that were about to be called in. The gilded life was a facade. Underneath the hand-stitched upholstery and the champagne fountains, the foundation was cracking. The dream fell apart in the boardroom, not on the runway. Maurizio was a visionary, but he was a catastrophic CEO. He lacked the basic discipline required to run a multinational corporation. While the brand was losing $30 million a year, Maurizio spent $40 million just to renovate the company's headquarters in Florence and Milan. He insisted on the finest marble, the rarest woods, and custom-designed furniture for offices that were increasingly empty. He was bleeding the company dry to maintain an image of success. The rest of the family saw the writing on the wall. His uncle Aldo and his cousins felt betrayed and sidelined. They watched as Maurizio dismantled the licensing empire they had built.
cutting off the cash flow that fueled their own lavish lifestyles. Legal battles erupted across 3 continents. There were lawsuits, countersuits, and allegations of tax evasion. In a move of staggering spite, Paolo Gucci provided the United States government with evidence that his own father, Aldo, had been skimming profits. At 81 years old, the man who built the empire was sent to an American prison for tax evasion. The Italian authorities were also closing in on Maurizio. There were whispers of forged signatures on the documents that gave him control of his father's shares. To save his skin and maintain his grip on power, Maurizio did the unthinkable. He invited an outside investment firm, the Bahrain-based Investcorp, to buy out his family members. One by one, he forced his cousins and his uncle to sell their shares. He traded his bloodline for a seat at the head of the table. He thought he had won. He thought he was finally the undisputed king of Gucci. He didn't realize he was inviting a shark into a bathtub. Investcorp wasn't interested in fashion or family legacy. They were interested in the bottom line, and the bottom line was red. Aldo Gucci was the architect of the impossible. If Guccio was the soul of the brand, Aldo was its cold, calculating brain. He didn't just want to sell leather, he wanted to own the very concept of luxury. By the early 1950s, the brand was a respectable Florentine secret. Aldo decided the secret was worth too much to keep in Italy. He took a plane to New York City when international travel was still a luxury for the few. He walked down Fifth Avenue and saw the future. He didn't see customers, he saw a gold mine waiting for a pickaxe. He opened the first Gucci boutique outside of Italy in 1953. It was a declaration of war against the established fashion houses of Paris. Aldo understood a fundamental truth about human psychology. People don't buy products, they buy proximity to power. He took the double G logo, a simple tribute to his father, and turned it into a global branding weapon. He stamped it on everything. He made sure that if a woman walked down the street in Manhattan or London, she wasn't just carrying a bag, she was carrying a flag. The brand became the uniform of the jet set. Grace Kelly wore their scarves. Jackie Kennedy carried their bags. This wasn't marketing. This was a hostile takeover of the global imagination. By the late 1960s, the numbers were staggering. The company was generating revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The profit margins on a single leather loafer were enough to fund a small village. But Aldo was a man of contradictions. He was a master of the front-facing image, yet he ran the internal business like a medieval fiefdom. He believed in the monopoly of the family name. He expanded the brand into perfumes, silks, and even Cadillac interiors. Every expansion was a calculated risk that paid off in mountains of cash. He created a licensing machine that was unprecedented in the fashion world. He figured out that he could sell the Gucci name to third-party manufacturers for a massive fee and a percentage of every sale. It was pure passive income. It was a license to print money. At its peak, there were over 22,000 different products bearing the Gucci name, from lighters to umbrellas to keychains. This was the golden era of the Gucci monopoly. They controlled the supply, they controlled the demand, and they controlled the price. Aldo moved the headquarters to a massive complex in Milan and solidified the brand's position as the king of the gray market. He was moving capital through offshore accounts and complex corporate shells long before it was a standard practice for the elite. He understood that the only thing more important than making money was keeping it out of the hands of the government. He was a master of tax avoidance, a skill he would later regret. Under Aldo's reign, Gucci became more than a company. It became a sovereign state with its own rules. He didn't answer to shareholders. He didn't answer to banks. He only answered to the bloodline. But the bloodline was thinning. The very expansion that made them billionaires was starting to rot the brand from the inside. The exclusivity was fading.
When you can buy a Gucci keychain at a gas station, the magic of the Savoy Hotel begins to evaporate. Aldo was drowning the brand in its own success. He was obsessed with the bottom line of the balance sheet, ignoring the fact that luxury is built on scarcity, not volume. The family was now a collection of multimillionaires who hated each other's guts. Aldo's brother Rodolfo watched from the sidelines, clutching his own share of the empire and raising his son Maurizio in a world of absolute, suffocating wealth. The stage was set for a clash of titans. Aldo had built a throne of gold, but he had forgotten to check the structural integrity of the floor beneath it. The monopoly was total. The wealth was absolute. But the foundation was made of glass. As the 1970s bled into the 80s, the family wasn't just fighting for more money. They were fighting for the right to destroy each other. Maurizio Gucci was the golden boy of a dynasty that had forgotten the smell of the sweat that built it. He was the son of Rodolfo Gucci, an actor who preferred the soft glow of film sets to the harsh reality of the leather trade. When Maurizio inherited his father's 50% stake in the company in 1983, he didn't just inherit a business, he inherited a throne, and he intended to sit on it with the weight of a Roman emperor. He lived a life that made the Great Gatsby look like a minimalist. His primary residence was an 11,000 square foot penthouse in the Olympic Tower on Fifth Avenue. It was a glass cage in the sky overlooking a city he intended to conquer. But New York was just the beginning. He maintained a massive villa in St. Moritz for the skiing season. He kept a palatial estate in Florence to remind the locals who truly owned the city's heritage. His fleet of cars wasn't just transportation. It was a collection of rolling art, each interior custom-stitched with leather that cost more than a suburban home. Then there was the Creole. This wasn't just a boat. It was a 200-foot wooden schooner, the largest of its kind in the world. Maurizio spent millions of dollars restoring it, obsessed with the idea that even the wood beneath his feet had to be aristocratic. He spent over $5 million just on the upholstery and the silver service for the dining cabin. He spent money not because he had it, but because he believed the Gucci name made him immune to the laws of arithmetic. At his side was Patrizia Reggiani. The press called her the Elizabeth Taylor of luxury. She was a woman who famously uttered the phrase, "I would rather cry in a Rolls Royce than be happy on a bicycle." Together, they were the ultimate power couple of the 1980s. They traveled by private jet between Milan, London, and Paris, staying only in suites that had been pre-scented with their preferred perfumes. They bought rare art, not for the beauty, but for the barrier it created between them and the common world. But Maurizio had a vision that went beyond mere spending. He looked at the Gucci brand and saw a diamond covered in mud. His uncle Aldo had spent decades putting the double G logo on everything. You could find Gucci on canvas sneakers, plastic keychains, and cheap lighters. To Maurizio, this was a sin against the bloodline. He wanted to return Gucci to its high fashion roots. He wanted to eliminate the middle-class customer entirely. He began a ruthless campaign to revoke thousands of licenses. He wanted to make Gucci so expensive and so rare that only the top 0.1% could even dream of touching it. It was a brilliant strategy on paper. It was a disaster in practice. To execute this plan, Maurizio needed a massive amount of liquidity. He was cutting off the very revenue streams that kept the lights on. He was killing the golden geese before the new eagles had even hatched. He spent $40 million just to renovate the company headquarters in Milan, filling it with marble floors and antique furniture, while the actual sales figures were plummeting. He treated the corporate treasury like a personal inheritance. He was obsessed with the aesthetics of power, but completely blind to the mechanics of profit. He would spend hours debating the exact shade of a silk lining while ignoring the fact that the company was burning through cash at a rate of tens of millions of dollars a year. He was a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. He thought that by surrounding himself with beauty, he could ward off the ugliness of a failing balance sheet. Patrizia watched this descent with a mixture of greed and growing terror. She loved the lifestyle,
But she loved the power even more. She saw Maurizio's erratic spending as a threat to her own status. The marriage began to fracture under the weight of their mutual vanity. Maurizio was no longer the focused heir. He was a man lost in a fantasy of his own making, convinced that his pedigree alone would save him from the creditors circling his estates. He was flying high, perched on the mast of the Creole, looking down at a world he thought he owned. He didn't realize that the higher you climb on a mountain of debt, the thinner the air becomes. He had the vision of a king, but he was playing a game he didn't understand. He had invited the world to watch his triumph, but he was actually giving them a front row seat to a slow-motion execution. The gilded life was about to lose its luster, and the people he had pushed aside were waiting in the shadows with a ledger of every debt he had failed to pay. But the real threat wasn't the banks or the declining sales. It was the people who shared his last name. They were tired of watching him burn their legacy to satisfy his ego. The family was preparing for a coup that would make the boardroom feel like a battlefield. The dream didn't just fade, it incinerated in the boardroom. Maurizio Gucci was a man who possessed the aesthetic eye of an artist, but the financial instincts of a gambler at a rigged table. He didn't just want to lead Gucci. He wanted to reinvent it in his own image, regardless of the cost. By the late 1980s, his hubris had become a systemic infection. He viewed the company's treasury as his personal inheritance, a bottomless well for his obsession with prestige. He spent $40 million just to renovate the company headquarters in Milan, turning an office into a palace of marble and mahogany, while the brand's actual product line was rotting on the shelves. The numbers were a bloodbath. Under Maurizio's watch, Gucci was hemorrhaging $30 million every single year. The brand was top-heavy and drowning in debt. He had successfully cleared out the quote, _2, canvas bags and keychains that kept the lights on. But he had nothing to replace them with. He was selling a dream that the market could no longer afford to buy. The family looked on in horror as their birthright was converted into expensive upholstery and failed marketing campaigns. The resentment that Gucci had planted decades ago finally reached its boiling point. His uncle Aldo and his cousins didn't just see a bad CEO, they saw a traitor. To them, Maurizio was a spoiled prince burning down the castle to stay warm. Legal warfare became the family's primary occupation. They filed suits in Florence, New York, and Hong Kong. They alleged tax evasion. They whispered about forged signatures. They tried to have him declared mentally unfit to lead. The Italian authorities, sensing blood in the water, began circling the empire. The Guardia di Finanza was no longer a shadow. They were at the door. Maurizio was cornered. He was a man who hated his own bloodline more than he loved his own company. To save himself from his relatives, he decided to perform a corporate exorcism. He reached out to Investcorp, a massive investment firm based in Bahrain. He didn't just ask for a loan, he invited a predator into the family sanctuary. He orchestrated a plan to have Investcorp buy out his disgruntled family members one by one. He used foreign capital to purge his own name from the payroll. It was a masterstroke of spite. By 1989, he had successfully ousted his uncle Aldo, the man who had actually built the global brand. Aldo, at 81 years old, was sent to an American prison for tax evasion, partly fueled by the internal chaos Maurizio had unleashed. Maurizio thought he had won. He sat at the head of the table,
the undisputed king of a billion-dollar empire. But he had forgotten the first rule of high finance. When you trade your family for a shark, you don't get a partner, you get a countdown. He had traded the Gucci bloodline for a seat that was already being pulled out from under him. He was a king without a kingdom, presiding over a mountain of debt and a staff that despised him. He believed his vision would eventually turn the tide, but the investors didn't care about vision. They cared about the bottom line. And the bottom line was a red river.
The stage was set for a final betrayal that would leave the family with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a target on Maurizio's. The transition from a family dynasty to a corporate entity was not a clean break. It was a slow, agonizing amputation. By the early 1990s, the air in the Gucci boardrooms had turned frigid. Maurizio had successfully removed his relatives, but he had also removed his shield. Without the family to blame for the company's failures, the spotlight shone directly on his own incompetence. Investcorp, the firm he had invited in to save him, began to realize they hadn't bought a luxury brand. They had bought a sinking ship, steered by a man who refused to look at the compass. The mechanics of the collapse were cold and mathematical. Maurizio's strategy of, quote, 3 had backfired. He had stopped the production of the mass-market items that generated cash flow, but the high-end leather goods weren't selling fast enough to cover the massive overhead. The company was facing a liquidity crisis. Suppliers weren't being paid. Craftsmanship was slipping. In 1993, the situation reached a breaking point. Investcorp delivered an ultimatum. They were tired of the $40 million renovations and the private jets while the ledgers were screaming in pain. They forced Maurizio to sell his remaining 50% stake in the company. The exit was a humiliation wrapped in a gold leaf. Maurizio walked away with $170 million in cash. To most, this would be a victory. To a Gucci, it was a death sentence. For the first time since 1921, the name on the door didn't match the name of the owner. The family was officially extinct within their own empire. Maurizio moved into a massive apartment on the Via Palestro in Milan, trying to reinvent himself as a private investor. But the ghosts of his past were already catching up to him. He had moved on to a new lover, Paola Franchi, a tall, blonde interior designer who represented the fresh start he craved. But in the shadows, Patrizia Reggiani was watching. The divorce had been finalized, but Patrizia refused to let go of the title of Signora Gucci. She famously stated that she would rather cry in a Rolls-Royce than be happy on a bicycle. To her, Maurizio hadn't just sold a company, he had sold her identity. He offered her an alimony settlement of $800,000 a year. It was a fortune to anyone else, but to Patrizia, it was a quote, _5, __. She began telling anyone who would listen that she wanted him dead. She asked her jeweler. She asked her lawyer. She even asked her psychic, Giuseppina Auriemma, if there was a way to make him disappear. Most people laughed it off as the bitter ramblings of a scorned socialite. They didn't realize that Patrizia was a woman who viewed life as a theater of power. If she couldn't be the queen of the Gucci empire, she would be its executioner. The open loop from the beginning of our story, the secret document signed in a Swiss hospital, now became the ultimate weapon. This document was the smoking gun regarding the inheritance of his father Rodolfo's shares. It proved that Maurizio had forged his father's signature to avoid a massive tax bill. Patrizia held this over his head like a guillotine. She knew that if the truth came out, Maurizio would lose everything he had left. But she didn't want him in prison. She wanted him gone. On a quiet morning in March 1995, the plan was set in motion. Patrizia didn't hire professional assassins. She was too paranoid for that. Instead, she used her psychic to recruit a group of amateurs, a debt-ridden hotel porter named Benedetto Seraulo, and a getaway driver who was a failed restaurant owner. It was a hit organized by the desperate and the deluded. As Maurizio climbed the red-carpeted stairs of his office building, he was a man who thought his troubles were behind him.
He had the money, he had the new woman, and he had his freedom. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him.
He didn't see the pistol. 4 shots rang out in the marble foyer. 3 hit him in the back, and the final one, the __quote_6__, was delivered to his temple as he lay on the floor. The heir to the leather throne was dead. The blood of the last Gucci owner stained the very luxury he had tried so hard to protect. By 1993, the Golden Boy had become a ghost in his own hallways. Maurizio Gucci had failed. He was a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. The boardrooms of Milan and New York had no more patience for his aristocratic fantasies. Investcorp, the Bahrain-based investment firm that Maurizio himself had invited into the inner sanctum to purge his own family, finally turned its blade on him. They forced him out. They paid him $170 million to simply disappear. For the first time since 1921, the name on the door did not match the blood in the veins of the owners. No one named Gucci owned a single share of Gucci. Maurizio walked away with a fortune, but he was a broken man, drifting through a sea of expensive distractions. He moved on to a new lover, Paola Franchi, and retreated into a world of private jets and silent villas. He told Patrizia Reggiani, the woman who had helped him climb to the top, that their marriage was over. He wanted a divorce. He offered her a settlement of $800,000 a year in alimony. To most, it was a king's ransom. To Patrizia, it was a declaration of war. She didn't want the money. She wanted the crown. She famously remarked that she would rather cry in a Rolls Royce than be happy on a bicycle. But now, she wasn't just crying. She was calculating. This brings us back to that secret document mentioned at the very beginning of our story. The document signed in a Swiss hospital. It was the original sin of Maurizio's career. When his father, Rodolfo, passed away, Maurizio was facing a massive inheritance tax bill that would have crippled his liquidity. To bypass the Italian state, Maurizio allegedly forged his father's signature on the stock certificates for the family's shares. It was a federal crime. It was the leverage Patrizia had held over his head for years. She knew that his entire empire was built on a foundation of ink and lies. She knew that if the law found out, Maurizio wouldn't just lose the company, he would lose his freedom. But the legal system was too slow for her rage. Patrizia began consulting Giuseppina Auriemma, a high society psychic who traded in tarot cards and dark whispers. Patrizia didn't ask about her future, she asked for a price. She needed a solution for the man she called a, quote, 7 on the Gucci legacy. The psychic became the broker. She reached out to a debt-ridden hotel porter named Pasquale Savioni, who in turn recruited a getaway driver and a hitman named Benedetto Cirolo. This wasn't a professional operation. It was a desperate hit organized by people who lived in the shadows of the luxury world they served. On the morning of March 27, 1995, the plan was set in motion. Maurizio Gucci arrived at his office building at Via Palestro 20 in Milan. The spring air was crisp. He carried a stack of fashion magazines under his arm. He walked past the doorman with the casual confidence of a man who thought his biggest problems were behind him. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him. He didn't see the muzzle of the weapon. Benedetto Cirolo fired 3 shots into Maurizio's back. As the heir to the Gucci dynasty collapsed onto the red marble floor, the hitman delivered a final 4th shot to his temple. The era of the Gucci family didn't end with a hostile takeover or a bankruptcy filing. It ended with 4 shots on a staircase and a pool of blood that no amount of Italian silk could soak up. The man who tried to save the brand by betraying his blood had finally been eliminated by the very woman he thought he had outmaneuvered. The open loop was closed. The secret document was now irrelevant because the man who signed it was dead. But as the police began to cordon off the crime scene, they realized that the murder was only the beginning of the brand's true transformation. The king was dead,
and the vultures were already circling the corpse of the empire.
The investigation would soon reveal that the killers were far from professionals. They were amateurs who couldn't keep their mouths shut. While Patrizia sat in her villa, thinking she had finally reclaimed her dignity, the paper trail of lire and betrayal was already leading the authorities straight to her door. The Gucci name was about to move from the fashion magazines to the front page of the crime section, and the fallout would ensure that the family would never hold power again. The investigation into the death of Maurizio Gucci was not a sophisticated chase through the underworld of international espionage. It was a sordid walk through the desperate fringes of Milanese society. The hitmen were not professionals. They were amateurs who left a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious it was an insult to the Italian police. They were caught because they couldn't stop talking. They bragged about the job in bars. They argued over the final payments. When the handcuffs finally clicked around the wrists of Patrizia Reggiani, the woman the media dubbed the Black Widow, she didn't collapse in tears. She draped herself in a fur coat, adjusted her jewelry, and walked to the police car as if she were boarding a private jet to St. Moritz. The trial was a circus of the macabre. It revealed a woman who had become so consumed by the brand name that she viewed her husband's existence as a stain on the leather. She didn't just want him gone, she wanted him erased for the crime of being mediocre. During the proceedings, it was revealed that she had asked her butcher, her grocer, and even her lawyer if they knew anyone who could eliminate Maurizio. She eventually settled on a debt-ridden hotel porter and a getaway driver who were recruited by her personal psychic, Giuseppina Auriemma. The total cost for the life of the heir to the Gucci throne was $365,000. To Patrizia, it was a bargain. She was sentenced to 29 years in prison. In a display of chilling arrogance that defined the Gucci era, she was later offered a chance at work release. She turned it down flat. She told the court that she had never worked a day in her life, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. She preferred the cold comfort of a prison cell to the indignity of a 9-to-5 job. She spent her time tending to her pet ferret and luxury plants behind bars, a fallen queen in a concrete palace. But while Patrizia sat in prison, the House of Gucci underwent a radical transformation. The family was gone, but the ghost of the brand was being resurrected by the very people Maurizio had invited in. Investcorp, the shark in the bathtub, did exactly what sharks do. They cleaned the blood off the floor and brought in fresh talent. They hired a young designer from Texas named Tom Ford and a ruthless executive named Domenico De Sol. Together, they did what the Gucci family couldn't do for 3 generations. They turned the brand into a disciplined, multi-billion-dollar machine. The irony is sharp enough to cut silk. Under the family, Gucci was a chaotic collection of lawsuits, tax evasion schemes, and cheap licensed keychains. Under corporate ownership, it became the pinnacle of global luxury. By the time the French conglomerate Kering took control, the company was worth more than $10 billion. The family members who had spent 70 years fighting for every cent were left on the sidelines. The wealth they had built was liquidated. It was swallowed by legal fees, inheritance taxes, and the massive settlements required to end their civil war. Today, there is not a single member of the Gucci family involved in the company. The name on the door is a ghost. The descendants of Guccio Gucci live relatively quiet lives, some in modest apartments, others in the lingering shadows of their former glory. They are the cautionary tale of the fashion world. They proved that a brand can survive a murder, but a family cannot survive itself. The empire didn't fall because of the 4 bullets fired on that March morning. It fell because the family forgot the first rule of the Savoy Hotel where it all began. Luxury is about how you carry yourself. And the Guccis carried themselves with a level of greed that eventually became too heavy to bear. The House of Gucci is now a corporate autopsy. It is a study in how to separate a name from a bloodline. The leather is still fine,
The double G logo still shines in the windows of boutiques from Paris to Shanghai. But the soul of the business was buried in a cemetery in Milan, along with Maurizio. The family traded their legacy for a decade of excess and a few years of spite. In the end, they were left with the one thing they feared most. They became ordinary. Wealth is a predator. It hunts the weak and it consumes the proud. If you do not control the money will eventually find a way to eliminate you. The House of Gucci was built on the finest Italian leather, but it was held together by a vanity that proved fatal. The empire was liquidated, the bloodline was purged, and the world moved on to the next season's collection. If you want to see how the world's greatest fortunes are made, exploited, and ultimately lost to the shadows, stay with us. Subscribe to follow the money.